Hello, I'm Sophie, here to co-present with Josée. I think they've got control of the slides, so they're going to bring that up. We're really excited to be here. It's kind of cool to see like a bunch of familiar names popping up. And yeah, let's get started. Yeah, I'll pass it back to Josée.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is so exciting. I know that both Sophie and I were talking about how hopeful it feels that so many of you were interested in learning about this topic. So we're really excited to be here. We hope you learned something new today. Yeah, we'll get started. So to start us off, we thought we'd introduce ourselves because I'm sure a lot of us are not, or a lot of you are not familiar with us. So I am Josée, my pronouns are she, they, and in my case, that means I appreciate when people alternate between using she, her, and they, them pronouns when they're referring to me or talking about me. I am white, I'm French Canadian, I am queer and genderqueer. I am also an ADHDer and I'm neurodivergent. So a lot of my own experiences, kind of made their way into our presentation today, or really inform, the way that I see neurodiversity. I am both a dietitian and a psychotherapist in private practice based in Ottawa. And in my practice, I support people with eating disorders, ADHDers, and folks in LGBTQ+ communities. And I also mentor and supervise dietitians who are wanting to embrace more progressive values in their practice. So that's me. Sophie, want to introduce yourself?
Okay, so hello, I'm Sophie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm white, queer, fat, cisgender woman with lived experience of both neurodivergence and disordered eating. I'm a registered psychotherapist, dropped my qualifying this morning. So some of the stuff might not be accurate. Anyways, I'm a registered psychotherapist in private practice in Ontario, also based in Ottawa. My work is informed by the principles of anti-oppression and feminist therapy. I love working with queer, trans, and gender nonconforming clients, as well as fat folks looking to divest from diet culture. I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, let's do this thing.
Awesome. So our plan for today, our presentation will be roughly divided into 3 parts. So first, Sophie is going to talk about what neurodiversity is so that folks can have a good understanding of where we're coming from. Next, we're going to look at how neurodiversity and eating disorders intersect, right? So we'll be presenting, some of the ways that might show up for folks. And the last piece, which I'm sure folks will be really looking forward to, is we're going to talk about strategies, practical ideas, both for practitioners, but also for folks with lived experience who might be in the room with us today. And before we get started, we had a few disclaimers we wanted to share. So one of the really important things we wanted to name is that there actually isn't that much research on this topic. And the research that does exist often isn't neurodiversity affirming. So a lot of the presentation today is actually based on a combination of lived experience and our professional experiences. So, the information we've pulled from learning from our community, right? Learning from the folks that we support. And then the other thing we wanted to name is that this is absolutely an introduction to this topic. We had many discussions about what pieces of information we actually wanted to include today because there's so much to be said on this topic. So we really encourage you to continue learning more as you leave today. And we want to name that, we're not going to capture every single experience, right, when it comes to neurodiversity and eating disorders. So just wanted to name that before we get started. Okay. We are very curious to hear where everyone is coming from, people's levels of, how people are feeling, right, as they're coming into this presentation. So we're going to do a little bit of a word cloud. I don't know if people are familiar with using Menti or Mentimeter. I'm going to stop sharing this screen and share a different screen so that you can participate in building a word cloud with us. Okay. There we go. So the question that we're asking is, how do you feel at the thought of providing or advocating for neurodiversity affirming eating disorder care? So in order to share your responses with us, we're going to invite you to go to menti.com and use this code 58465211, which someone will also put in the chat, so you can copy paste that if you'd like. Yeah, and then we want to hear how you're feeling. Just at the thought of providing that care or advocating for that care. So I'm already seeing some answers coming in. Nervous, curious, hopeful, protective. Oh my gosh, I feel that. All for it. Love that. Lack of lived experience. Yeah, absolutely. Interested, uncertain how to. Yeah. Excited. I love that that seems to be a common one. It's based on how big the words are, that usually means that like multiple people have said that. Loving seeing these come in. Daunted, insecure, collaborative, hesitant, a little shame or impostery. I feel that. Yeah. Necessary, absolutely. Which is why, you know, one of the reasons why we're so excited that you're all here today. Passionate, you and me both. Frustrated, yeah. Not sure, you know, what your particular reasons are for feeling frustrated, but certainly, you know, I think about going against a system, right? And how frustrating that can be and how many barriers there can be. Yeah. Trying to see if there's anything else here that stimulated, relieved, ready to learn. Don't want to cause harm. Yeah, absolutely. Challenged, tired. I think that makes a lot of sense. Wonderful. Okay. Word cloud has calmed down a little bit, which tells me that we probably have most of our responses here. Thank you so much for everyone who participated. It's really, really nice to see where folks are at as we're starting this. So I'm going to flip back over to our presentation. Okay. Thank you for your patience as I do this juggling. Awesome. All right, so on that note, let's get into it. So we're going to start with actually looking at what neurodiversity is. So I will now pass this along to Sophie. Sophie, just let me know when you're ready to change the slides and I'll do that.
I am ready. Oh, I'm not ready. Hold on one second. Okay, I'm ready. So thanks for participating in that word cloud. We actually want to get some more answers from you. Before we sort of get into the section on what neurodiversity is, it would be kind of cool to just get an idea of like a little bit of your understanding. So we have a true or false question for you. So we are wondering, there's a little poll at the bottom of your screen. There should be a little like poll button that you can click. So our question is, folks with borderline personality disorder, which is BPD, are considered neurodivergent. So just, yeah, what are your thoughts about that? Does that feel true? Does that feel false? We'll just give a couple minutes to see these answers roll in. Y'all are on the ball. It's wonderful. Okay. It's interesting. We're sitting at about like sort of 50-50. Okay, I didn't know what to expect with that question, but that's okay. Okay, yeah, we're about half and half. All right. Okay, all right. I think we can move on to the next slide and get into it. So the answer is true. And, and later in this presentation, just in a few slides, I'll sort of explain how that works. So for now, before we go throwing around these terms throughout our presentation, we thought we'd give you a little overview because, you know, words mean things. So the biggest mistake that's commonly made is using neurodiversity and neurodivergence interchangeably. So neurodiversity speaks to the diversity of how our minds function, and also actually includes both neurotypical and neurodivergent folks. So when you want to be specific about someone whose experience diverges from the assumed norm, please be sure to use neurodivergent. Basically, a population can be neurodiverse, but a person cannot. Okay. Should go to the next slide. Thank you. Excellent. So I really like these, just to get a little more specific, I really like these definitions by Dr. Nick Walker. You can check out her work on neuroqueer.com, which will be listed in our references at the end of the presentation. So yeah, just to get a little more specific. So neurodiversity is the diversity of human minds, the infinite variation in neurocognitive functioning within our species. And as you can see within that, we have neurotypical folks who have a style of neurocognitive functioning that falls within the dominant societal standards of normal, as well as neurodivergent folks who have minds that function in ways which diverge significantly from the dominant societal standards of normal. This being said, I want to be clear that neurotypicality and neurodivergence are not binary or opposite experiences. Folks who are neurodivergent exist on a continuum with varying proximity to neurotypicality and ability to meet neurotypical societal expectations. Generally, the closer one is or appears to be to neurotypical, the easier one is able to move about the world. Being neurodivergent tends to mean more barriers. And we want to be clear that the problem does not lie within neurodivergent folks, but rather within an ableist culture. And of course, experiences of privilege and marginalization are informed by other intersecting identities and experiences such as gender, race, sexuality, and much more. Okay, so this is sort of back to the like true or false question. So when we talk about neurodivergence, often the first thing that comes to mind is autism and ADHD. But it's important to remember that actually neurodivergence is comprised of a range of experiences outside of what is considered neurotypical. So to help illustrate this point, here's an offering made by the brilliant Sunny Jane Wise. They are the lived experience educator on Instagram. Go follow them, go support their work. They're amazing. So this shows us some of what falls under what they call the neurodivergent umbrella. As you can see, when we talk about neurodivergence, we're also talking about some mental health conditions, as these conditions impact how we understand and interact with the world. These differences in how we understand and interact with the world are what I'm going to discuss next. All right, so keeping in mind that the concept of neurodivergence attempts to encapsulate a huge range of experiences, there are certain commonalities experienced by most neurodivergent folks. These include differences in things like sensory processing, executive functioning, interpersonal communication, and emotional regulation. I'll explain a little bit about each now, and then later in our presentation, Josée will show us how these differences can impact neurodivergent folks' relationship with food and eating. So when it comes to sensory processing, neurodivergent folks often experience hyper and or hyposensitivity to sensory inputs such as sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. Other sensory processing differences include proprioception, which is sort of the perception of where you are in space, vestibular, which is your sense of balance, and interoception, the perception of the sensations you have within your body. One sense can be over or hypersensitive, while others are under or hyposensitive. And just to note on language, hypersensitive doesn't mean people are overreacting. They're actually reacting exactly how their body is processing the sensory information. Moving into executive functioning, So executive functioning is a set of cognitive abilities that includes things like working memory, planning, problem solving, time awareness, and regulating attention. Working memory is the process of holding information online while accessing other cognitive functions. So for example, if you're taking notes during this presentation. Planning refers to the ability to identify and select relevant actions needed for a task. So for example, organizing your schedule to be able to attend this presentation. Problem solving means working through details and evaluating options to come to solutions. Time awareness can include the ability to estimate the amount of time needed for a task. And regulating attention refers to focusing on one task at a time. So we can see difficulties with this in moments of hyperfocus or distractibility. It's common for neurodivergent folks to experience challenges in executive functioning. We want to be clear that these challenges are not deficits and are often simply amplified by folks' environments and a lack of accommodation. All right, communication. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to communication with neurodivergent folks is that body language, including eye contact or lack thereof, can be easily misunderstood if interpreted through a neurotypical lens. As well, a lot of neurodivergent folks appreciate clear and concise language. This isn't because neurodivergent folks don't understand nuance, but simply that they can find the use of metaphors and euphemisms frivolous and unnecessary. One of my favorite things about working with neurodivergent clients is how many of them are willing to push back on sort of arbitrary rules about communication and find ways of communicating that make sense for them. And I'll talk about this more in the practical tips section. Another thing I just want to make sure to note. So when it comes to communication, I think it's important to remember that while clients may have particular ways of communicating, they're also observant and they can see that some forms are prized over others in a largely ableist society. So as a result, many neurodivergent folks engage in masking, which is an emotionally onerous task of making their ways of being line up as much as possible with neurotypical expectations. We're going to talk about that throughout our presentation. All right, now on to emotional regulation. Contrary to what's sometimes assumed, neurodivergent folks have rich and layered emotional lives. This being said, there are some aspects of neurodivergence, such as differences in interoception. Remember, this is that sense of being able to recognize sensations within your body. These can impact our ability to recognize emotions. And then on the other hand, we might experience emotions very intensely, which can be distressing. And then our attempts to self-regulate can look outsized to a neurotypical observer. What I mean by this is that one of the ways a lot of neurodivergent folks self-regulate is through stimming. I don't know if you've noticed that I've been playing with an elastic this whole time. That's a good example. So stimming is essentially a self-stimulating repetitive behavior that can help ease physical and emotional distress. This can look like fidgeting, rocking back and forth, tapping feet. You can probably see I'm also moving my chair back and forth. Because of neurotypical expectations, many neurodivergent folks have been made to feel ashamed of the things they do to stim and actually expend a lot of energy trying to control these behaviors, which brings me back to the concept of masking. So when it comes to masking, I just want to drive home the point that it's a protective mechanism used by folks to avoid rejection. And while that is understandable in the context of an ableist world, it's also emotionally exhausting. The more safety we can create for folks to unmask, the better. What does it mean to be neurodiversity affirming? In a nutshell, being neurodiversity affirming is about meeting clients where they're at and believing they know themselves and what they need best. It's about acknowledging that the way we show up in the world is impacted by several factors, including the way our brains work within a world built for neurotypical minds. Remember, working with neurodivergent folks means working with difference, not deficits. Making space for clients to show up fully as themselves means a more trusting relationship between client and practitioner, where you can collaborate on treatment plans, which ultimately leads to better outcomes. I'd like to end this section on a note about self-diagnosis. This comes up often and has certainly come up in the neurodivergent support group that Josée and I co-facilitate for Sheena's Place. So though we acknowledge that formal diagnoses are sometimes necessary to access certain treatments, such as medication, as well as are sometimes empowering for folks to have their experiences named, we contend that self-diagnosis is valid, especially within the context of the barriers to accessing testing, including the cost, and the historically sexist and racist field of psychology. The pursuit of a diagnosis can be potentially traumatizing for many folks. What's more, it may not be necessary if practitioners are open to accommodating their approaches to suit neurodivergent needs. So, all right, now I'm going to pass things back to Josée, who will look at how neurodivergence and eating disorders intersect.
Thank you so much, Sophie. All right, so now that hopefully everyone has some understanding around neurodiversity versus neurodivergence, right? And yeah, an idea of what that might look like for different people. Let's move into talking about how this intersects with eating disorders. And again, just want to name that we're going to be capturing a very small part of people's experiences in our presentation today, just because there's so much variation in terms of how this can be experienced by different people. But we wanted to focus on maybe some common experiences that we've seen. And to start, I'm just going to throw another poll at you. So I'm just going to launch that one. So I would love to know how familiar you are with how eating disorders intersect with neurodivergence. So is this a topic that feels new to people? Okay. I'm going to give it a few seconds before I share the results with everyone. Okay, we still have some answers coming in, so I'll give people another few seconds. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So hopefully everyone can see that. So it looks like more than half of you said that you're somewhat familiar. So maybe have some understanding or some knowledge of this intersection. About a third of you are not familiar at all, and so I'm especially glad that folks are here. And then we have some folks who are very familiar too, which is really awesome. So thank you everyone for participating. All right, so let's first look at sensory processing and how that can show up in terms of eating disorder experiences. So it can really intersect with eating disorders in many, many ways. And one of those ways is in meal preparation or cooking, right? Everything that has to do with having to plan meals, prepare meals, cook meals. There's so many different ways that sensory processing differences might make that task challenging for people. One of the ways to think about it is just how much sensory input there is in a kitchen, for example, right? So if we think about potential challenges, we might think about smells, right? There tends to be really strong smells in a kitchen as we're, throwing ingredients in a pan and things like that. A lot of kitchens have really bright, harsh lighting, for example, or might be very dimly lit, and either or of those, might feel uncomfortable. There's a lot of sounds happening in a kitchen, right? If we think about the microwave beeping, the sizzling in a pan, opening and closing of cupboards or the fridge, right? The sound of different types of plates touching each other. There's all sorts of different sounds happening, and that can easily become quite overwhelming. There might also be more accidents. So if we think about spatial awareness, right? There might be a higher chance of people accidentally burning themselves or cutting themselves or hitting their bodies on different parts of the kitchen. And then textures too, right? Whether that's like touching certain types of foods, if we think about like raw meat, for example, I know is a common one in terms of like that feeling pretty uncomfortable, right? And distressing for folks. Or even looking at food in the water when you're doing dishes, right? So those kind of unexpected pieces of foods that end up in the water. So there's a lot of different ways that can show up in the kitchen, you know, in the meal prep and cooking process. Another, you know, possible time, if you look at eating disorder recovery, where sensory processing differences are important to consider, is during mealtime. So mealtime can also be really challenging to navigate. If we think of, again, you know, all the different types of sensory input that can take place during meals. And this is especially true if people don't have access to tools or have access to accommodations that helps them to meet their sensory needs. So examples might be, you know, hearing other people eat, or, you know, certain textures that feel, again, that might be uncomfortable or distressing. It might be the certain type of cutlery that's available, right? People might have, you know, very, like a lot of differences in terms of what type of cutlery they like using, whether that's because of the texture or the weight or the feel of it on their, you know, in their mouth or on their teeth. And so that is another piece that we want to think about in terms of sensory processing. Folks might also feel understimulated, right? So a lot of the examples I've given are examples where folks might feel overstimulated, right? Because of a lot of different types of stimulation at meals. But, you know, there's also something to be said around being understimulated, especially if we're in the context where something like mindful eating is being promoted, right? Where maybe there's a lot of focus on limiting sensory input. For a lot of folks, that can actually feel quite intolerable and distressing. Uncomfortable seating might be another example, right? Different types of seats might feel uncomfortable to certain people. And that's especially true for, you know, fat folks, for example, right? Who may or may not fit in the seating that's being offered. And so that's another piece, right? Where sensory challenges might cause a lot of distress, and we want to be thinking about how we might be able to change our environments, right? Or provide the tools that people need in order to feel more comfortable in those settings. So the next piece that I wanted to talk about is interception. So Sophie also already talked about interception being, you know, the sense of feeling the internal processes happening in our body, right? So having an awareness of those different things happening internally. And in terms of eating disorder recovery, this can be particularly challenging if we look at the ability to recognize hunger, fullness, or thirst, right? So those are body signals, they're body cues. And folks, you know, might have sensory differences when it comes to noticing and having awareness of interception. So some people might, you know, actually not recognize the cues, right? Particularly maybe those early signs of hunger, for example, or early signs of fullness. So some people might be better able to recognize it when those signals are quite loud, right? But when they're really quiet, it might be hard to recognize that. On the other side of things, right, folks might actually be have increased interceptive awareness or interception, which can also be really distressing, right? So for example, after a meal, someone might have like a lot of awareness of their digestion happening, right? And again, that can cause a lot of distress and discomfort. And of course, you know, we know that some eating disorder behaviors sometimes are there to help alleviate some of that distress. So an important note that I want to share is that in eating disorder recovery, or in the support that maybe we're offering, or, you know, if you're someone with lived experience and this is something that you do experience, we want to think about how, achieving interoception or increasing interoception isn't always actually the goal, right? We don't want to make the assumption that everyone can or should have interoceptive awareness, because that actually leaves a lot of neurodivergent people behind. So we can actually, if folks are interested and wanting to get curious about interoception, then absolutely we can, provide that support with a lot of informed consent. But we shouldn't assume that that's what people want. And if, there's a lot of other ways that we can help people meet their needs without, having to change their experience of interoception. So definitely something that I wanted to name. Very quickly, I also wanted to name that interoception can play a role in terms of our capacity to name and recognize emotions, right? So if we think about emotions often being very body-based, right? We get a lot of cues from our bodies, which help us pinpoint what type of emotion we might be feeling. If it's harder to recognize some of those cues, it might then also be harder to name emotions. Or on the other end of things, right, if folks have very strong interoceptive awareness, those body cues can be actually quite overwhelming, right? And it can be really hard to know what to do with all of that, right? Or to decipher what all of it means. So again, an area where there might be differences, right, that we want to be aware of. So the next area we wanted to look at is executive functioning. Challenges with executive functioning or differences in terms of executive functioning can definitely, create a lot of barriers to people's recovery or process in terms of their relationship with food and their bodies. So I want us all to just take a moment to think about all the steps that go into nourishing ourselves. Right? So first, we need to be aware that it's time to eat, right? So whether that's through an internal cue or an external cue, like something has to tell us, okay, now it's time to eat. Next, we have to decide what to eat, right? So there's another opportunity for like decision-making and planning. Then we actually have to get that food ready, right? And that's not just one step, that's like multiple steps, right? We have to take food out of the cupboard and the fridge. We have to maybe find or follow a recipe. We have to open packages. We have to cut up and prepare the ingredients, cook various ingredients, mix some of them, right? We have to plate the food. We have to put the ingredients away. We have to, take any waste and put it in the garbage or recycling or compost, put things back in the fridge. We have to wipe the counter. We have to, you see what I mean, right? This could go on and on and on. So there's so many steps involved, right, in terms of nourishing ourselves. And for a lot of neurodivergent folks, there can be, challenges at essentially any of those steps, right, can cause some challenges. Or sometimes it's the fact that it's all of these steps feels extremely overwhelming, right? And it can be very hard to get started. So examples of those potential challenges might be, for example, following a recipe while they're cooking. So that, that is our working memory, right? Our ability to hold multiple pieces of information in our brain at the same time. People might get overwhelmed not knowing what to buy at the grocery store, right? That requires planning. It might be like, choosing what to make for a meal or a snack, especially if there are constraints, like there's not a lot of time, for example, right? Problem solving might be difficult. Being focused on a task and forgetting to eat, right? So if you think about our ability to regulate our attention, that might play into it as well. Other examples might be, forgetting the foods that are in the fridge and pantry, or not having clean dishes to make or serve a meal, or sometimes underestimating the time it takes to prepare a meal. So there's a lot of different ways that executive functioning can come in and play a role. Another really important way that eating disorders and neurodivergence can intersect is when we look at the fact that people who are neurodivergent or neurodivergent people are coping with depression, right? So we already talked about ableism. If you're not familiar with Sheenism, I'll encourage you to Google it. There's a lot of good stuff out there talking about that, but essentially, two forms of oppression that folks face, and oftentimes that even, that intersects with other marginalized identities that people hold. And eating disorder behaviors might actually be a way that people cope with the trauma of experiencing this world, right, under these oppressive systems. And so there's an opportunity for us to get curious about the protective role, right, that the eating disorder might play. Now, again, this can show up in so many different ways, but to give you an example of maybe some of the things that we've seen, right, or the stories that we've heard, it might be, the eating disorder might be there as a way to make someone smaller, right, in a world where they feel that they're too much or they take up too much space. It might be a way to gain acceptance from others by following the social expectations, right? So if we think about diet culture being the norm in a lot of ways, right? For some folks, there might be a role there in terms of gaining acceptance in a world where otherwise they might not experience a lot of acceptance. It might be something that people can quote unquote succeed at, right? So if we think about the fact that a lot of people feel that they're failing, right? Because this world has all of these very, very ableist expectations of how you should be quote unquote functioning, right? Or the things you should be able to do. Sometimes people feel that, being able to actually engage in eating disorder behaviors feels empowering, right? They feel like they're succeeding at something. It might be a way that people cope with isolation, right? Seeing the eating disorder as a friend. It might feel familiar, really comforting. And eating disorders we can also look at it as a form of masking, right? So again, maybe a way that people try to kind of mimic neurotypical standards or expectations as a way to protect themselves, right? As a way to survive in a world that's otherwise can be, very harmful and very hurtful. So something to think about, right? Really exploring what this means for people. I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. It's also important to note that context matters. So some behaviors might appear to be connected to the eating disorder when they actually stem from neurodivergent traits. So examples of that, right, might be, for example, not wanting to eat with others, right? So maybe folks, again, are feeling really overstimulated at meals when they are eating with other people. They might be avoiding certain foods, but that might not be part of their eating disorder. That might be like sensory processing differences, for example. If we look at skipping meals, might be because someone's forgetting to eat, right? Or maybe they take stimulants, for example, and their appetite is really low. And so they don't, they're not getting cues that it's time to eat. Think about wearing loose clothing, right? That's often something that people will think as an eating disorder behavior. People wanting to hide their bodies, for example. When, if you look at it from a neurodivergent lens, maybe again, it's coming from sensory differences, right? Maybe folks actually find it very uncomfortable to be wearing tighter clothes from a sensory lens. So there's a lot of different ways that this can show up. All right. So let's move into some strategies and some practical ideas. And to get us started on that, we have another true or false question. So I will launch that for you all. So true or false, providing accommodations for neurodivergence and eating disorder care requires a large number of resources. I'll let people answer. I'll take a sip while people are taking a second to think about that. Okay. give people another second. I'm also just catching up on the comments in the chat. Okay, awesome. I will end the poll. So about 25% of you, so 24% of you said true, 76% said false. And so we believe that the answer is false. Now, perhaps this is a situation where it's not so black and white and there could be discussion about this, but we believe the answer is false. There are absolutely things that we could start doing today, right? That would really make eating disorder care a lot more neurodivergent friendly. So we will walk you through some of the ideas that we have, again, not an exhaustive list, right? And this is going to look different for everyone, of course. All right, so Sophie, I will pass it on to you to get us started in this section.
Excellent. Thank you, Josée. And thank you to everyone who responded to that poll. I'm hoping that this section, which I'm sure, like Josée said, you've all been looking forward to, can maybe convince you that, you know, being supportive for, or being neurodiversity affirming is within your reach, even if you don't have maybe some like specialized training. Some of the advice I'll be giving myself, which is more about like the sort of emotional experience versus like the eating stuff or eating tips. It's really about a way of like being with our clients rather than a way of doing. So the first things first, it's imperative that we create recovery plans that work for each individual client, right? So this is true for all clients, of course, but supporting neurodivergent folks means collaborating on treatment plans that take into account their particular experiences with sensory processing, executive functioning, communication, and emotional regulation. Please continue to seek out information to learn more about neurodivergence, like you're all doing today, especially from folks with lived experience. So in order to create safer environments for neurodivergent folks, as practitioners, we must operate from a stance of believing our clients and validating their lived experience. What this can look like in practice is getting curious when a client suspects they may be neurodivergent, rather than dismissing this possibility if you haven't had reason yet to suspect it. You know, neurodivergence is an internal experience. And as I've mentioned, most neurodivergent folks expend a lot of energy, a lot of emotional energy, masking. Remember this when someone is doing the vulnerable work of sharing their experience with you. Trust that clients know themselves best. In practice, this could look like brainstorming together for solutions for particular eating challenges, as well as being open to the possibility that some approaches from traditional eating disorder care may not meet their needs. So, just getting into more therapist talk. So much of our work as therapists is about fostering self-acceptance in our clients and reminding them of their inherent worth. So it's one thing to say these things, and quite another to put this into practice by embracing clients' full selves in session. Do you allow your clients to stim while in session? Do you expect a certain amount of eye contact? We encourage you to think about how you may be reinforcing ableist ideas about wellness by expecting your clients to adhere to neurotypical expectations. Really, how can we expect clients to accept themselves fully if we signal to them that they're somehow lacking? I'm going to pass it back over to Josée.
Thanks, Sophie. So coming back to the piece around how, we need to get curious around behaviors that might seem like they're stemming from the eating disorder, but might actually be a neurodivergent trait, right? So we need to really approach this with curiosity and not automatically assume that something is like quote unquote disordered, right? There's a lot of different ways that people might show up in treatment or in their recovery or in their care that actually makes a lot of sense. So one of the ways that we might try to parse these things apart, and this might be something that like folks with this experience explore for themselves as well, right? Is getting curious about the intention behind behavior. So if we're someone who's providing that support, we might ask people what the intention is, right? Or maybe what the origin of their behavior is. So if it's something that's been around in their life forever, right? Maybe that clues us into the fact that it isn't actually part of the eating disorder, or maybe it's more connected to their neurodivergence. Or asking what they fear would happen if they couldn't engage in that behavior, right? That might help us to identify like where the anxiety is coming from, right? So that we can then, better address some of those concerns, right? Or better address like some of the distress or discomfort that folks are experiencing. And, perhaps for folks who are here who have lived experience, having that understanding of what pieces of your experience come from, the eating disorder versus the neurodivergence. Not that those are completely separate, as we can see from our conversation today, but sometimes it can be helpful to, get a sense of where that's coming from. It can inform a lot of the next steps. Pass it back to Sophie.
All right, so on to the communication piece. So talked a lot about believing our clients and trusting their lived experience. We can do this while also certainly acknowledging that sometimes communicating this internal experience can be a challenge for neurodivergent folks. So some ways that we can work with our clients' communication differences are as follows. So we can offer different client session formats, such as like phone sessions or having the video off on a video call, if that's more comfortable for the client. You can just adapt a client's preferred communication style. So that can look like using the chat, not forcing eye contact, or assuming the meaning of nonverbal cues. Again, it's sort of about being curious and like letting the client lead you to what's best for them. A big one is allowing clients to stim or engage in other activities, for example, doodling, that help them focus in session. It can feel sort of paradoxical to neurotypical folks, but for neurodivergent folks, like engaging in an activity like doodling or stimming, actually helps their focus in session. And increases their comfort. So see what it's like to let them do that. And then another piece for practitioners who may also be neurodivergent, it can really be helpful to push back against neurotypical ideas of professionalism and unmask yourself. This can definitely be like a challenge and I don't know, uncomfortable in different ways, but it can also be kind of magical when you signal to your clients that like, everyone's different. Some of us are neurodivergent and that's okay. Practice unmasking. And so earlier, Josée did a good job of explaining how interception can or interoceptive awareness, either like, a lot of it or not very much of it, can impact sort of how folks identify and name emotions they're feeling. So being aware of these differences in interoception, we have some tools that you can use. I have like a little, it's probably pretty tiny on your screen, but I have an example here. This is an emotion sensation wheel made by Lindsay Brahman. Please support her work. Go buy the emotion sensation wheel. She's brilliant. Basically, it has like emotions and then the sensations associated with them. And one of the things that's really cool is that in addition to this sort of like classic wheel, she also has a wheel that you can fill in yourself. So when clients, maybe make connections between physical sensations they're experiencing and their emotions, they can sort of like make a wheel that accurately reflects their individual experience. It's awesome, very helpful. And for neurotypical clients too, naming emotions is not always easy. So, go support Lindsay's work. And then to account for differences in like, the perception of time, for example, a lot of neurodivergent folks are like, I'd love to, check in with myself and my body and my emotions, but like, when time is just, you can use things like apps and reminders to have the clients sort of put aside some time to check in on their thoughts, emotions, or sensations. my brain just like stopped working for a second. So let me just like get back into it. Anyways, so with this being said, I think it's also important that we sort of ask ourselves, like as therapists, like, do we need to get to the emotion in order to help? Can we instead move toward what needs are asking to be met? If we think about what Josée mentioned earlier, if we want to be neurodiversity affirming, part of that means challenging the assumption that increasing interception should always be the goal. Going back to Josée.
So, yeah, so the next part we wanted to look at is thinking about sensory considerations, right, in different parts of people's eating disorder experience. But in this case, we wanted to offer some possible tools during meals. Right? So these are examples that that we've pulled from like different people's lived experience, right? What has felt helpful for them. So it can be anything from, for example, wearing earplugs or noise canceling headphones during meals to help reduce that like auditory stimulation. We might offer various seating options and let people pick the type of seating that feels best for them. And maybe that even means that people don't sit at a table when they eat. And I know that feels like quite counter to a lot of what's often promoted in eating disorder treatment. There often is this kind of expectation that people will sit at tables while they're eating. But yeah, we might think about how actually meals might be a lot easier for folks if they don't have to sit at a table for some people. We might look at having ways to adjust lighting, right? Having different ways to change the level of light or even the warmth of the light. Sometimes, cool lights versus warm lights can feel, a bit better for people. If we're in a setting where we can't necessarily adjust the lighting, folks might want to wear sunglasses, for example, as they're eating. We might, want to have a blanket while we're eating. For some folks, it feels really grounding to have that weight on their legs, for example. So maybe we offer some blankets or we include those in mealtime. We might have various cutlery options so people, again, can pick what feels best for them. We might have lots of fidgets around. And again, there is no limit to what fidgets are or can be, right? I know that like one of the things I'll often fidget with is like hair clips, right? Or even bobby pins or elastics, or I have a little stuffed animal here with me that I fidget with. So fidgets can be whatever, right? Anything that feels like stimulating for people. And then for folks who might be quite understimulated, right? Or like experience distress from being understimulated, they might actually benefit from like listening to music or a podcast or watching TV as they eat. And I know that this, might feel a little counter to, again, our pretty like typical narrative around mindful eating. But for some people, that's really not going to be most supportive. And so we might explore other ways of making meal times feel a little bit more tolerable. And if that means that people are eating in a way where they're distracted, I think that's perfectly acceptable, right? And that can absolutely be part of people's lives. So executive functioning considerations. So around planning and preparing meals, there's a lot of ways that this could look like as well. These are really just some examples that we pulled from our brains. It might look like collaborating on making grocery lists. So that might be, for example, in a dietitian session, right? Being able to collaborate on what's going to go on the list, because sometimes having to make those decisions can feel, really difficult. It might be using shortcuts, right? So using foods that are pre-prepared, pre-chopped. Yes, that can mean processed foods, right? Really anything that allows people to skip some steps, right? So if we think back to when I walked you through all of the possible steps, right, in terms of getting to nourishment, it's a lot. And so if there are any ways that we can take shortcuts and eliminate some of those steps, that can feel very worthy. Body doubling. So what that means, so body doubling is a tool that a lot of neurodivergent people use in order to find the momentum to do certain tasks. And so, for example, that might mean that someone might be doing their dishes while they're talking with a friend on the phone, for example, right? Or it might be that, they're working on an assignment while having a friend over at their house. And that doesn't even mean that the person has to help them with the task, right? Sometimes the simple act of having someone around can really help people find that momentum and initiate tasks. And there are ways we can even do that, during sessions. So I, support some people who, we do phone sessions so that during our therapy session, they can be doing dishes or tidying up their space or, doing whatever else it is that they want to be doing. So yeah, there's a lot of ways that we can contribute to body doubling, or people might access body doubling with friends or family or other people in their lives. People might, if they have the resources, to get meal delivery kits. That can be a really helpful way to limit the decision-making in terms of what to eat, although it still requires cooking. So for some people, that may or may not be helpful. Having visible pantries can be really useful. I know a lot of neurodivergent people who have decided to take the cupboards, the door, right, off of their cupboards so that they can actually see what's inside. Sometimes that helps a lot to, just see what's there, right, and help remind people of what's there. Same thing around having, let's say, clear containers in their fridge, right? So is there the plastic containers or glass containers or whatever that they're using to store food? Is it clear? Are they clear so they can actually see what's inside, right? Sometimes that's really useful. Might look like having Post-its or a whiteboard listing what's in the fridge or what's in the cupboard. Forgetting what's there, I know, is a big challenge that a lot of folks have mentioned in my work. And so if we can find ways to kind of prompt our brains, right, so that we can remember what's in there, that can be really useful. If we look at actual appointments, do we offer session reminders, right? Having a system with automated session reminders can be really useful so that people are reminded that they have a place to be. Can we offer a summary of what was discussed in session, right? And that doesn't have to be long. I know if we have any healthcare providers in the room who are like, oh no, more work. Sometimes it's literally sending 2 or 3 bullet points that just highlight what was discussed today, right? So that people can go back to that and remember. Because oftentimes if we look at memory, right, a lot of folks might just forget what was discussed in session, and that's very valid. As Sophie mentioned, do we allow or provide fidgets, right, during appointments or in different forms of treatment? Do we allow people to take notes, right, so that they have, again, they can go back to what was discussed? So lots of different ways. And again, this is just some ideas that we had, but there's so many different ways that can take place. And, we can use people's lived experience as the guide in terms of figuring out what's going to be most useful. So I wanted to make a quick note on intuitive eating, because I imagine some of you are familiar with intuitive eating or have heard about it and are wondering how this fits in, right? So I pulled 3 principles. So for folks who are familiar with intuitive eating, it's a set of 10 principles. And I pulled 3 of them that I feel might need some, some tweaking in order to be a little bit more neurodiversity affirming. The first one is this idea of making peace with food. So I really want to name and emphasize that not all foods will be accessible to people. And that's okay, right? If we look at it, for example, from a sensory aversions lens, right? So folks might have very real, very valid sensory aversions to foods. And while this is not a session about, talking about that and exposure therapy and that type of thing, if we look at sensory processing differences as not a deficit, but a difference, right? That means we need to be willing to make accommodations or provide accommodations, right? So, you know, quote unquote, fixing people's sensory aversions might not actually be the goal in treatment, right? The goal is to help people access safety, and that's different. So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight. And of course, we could have a whole discussion about that piece alone, but just wanted to kind of put that on people's radar. We already talked about hunger and fullness. So hunger and fullness are addressed in intuitive eating. It's often considered like the way that people determine how much to eat and when to eat, which, you know, for some folks might be great, but it doesn't consider differences in interoception, right? So building interoception might not be the goal, as we've already mentioned. People might use external cues to remind them to eat, right? Or to know how much to eat, and that's okay, right? That might be where people stay forever, and that is okay. If the goal is nourishment, if the goal is safety, if the goal is, you know, people feeling empowered, then that can absolutely fit into that. And then the last piece is coping with emotions with kindness. So that is one of the principles of intuitive eating as well. And I just wanted to name that eating in response to physical, emotional, and sensory needs, all of that is valid, right? So people might eat, for example, as a form of stimming, and we never want to pathologize that, right? Or shame people for that, or make them feel that that's absolutely something they need to change. Folks may want to work on, you know, developing tools and feeling more equipped to cope with emotions, and that, you know, is absolutely something that we can look at. But again, it's about the assumptions that we're making and maybe the judgments that we're making, right? So being really willing to remove the morality out of like using food to stim, for example. All right, and a last note is on the idea of normal eating. And this is this is a term that actually is used like fairly often in different forms of eating disorder treatment, where, you know, maybe we look at people's behaviors and we compare that to like what is normal, right? And I really, really want to push back on that idea. Everyone's version of what's normal for them is going to look different. And we need to be willing to question and challenge what we consider to be normal, right? So just because we're not used to seeing a certain behavior around food, it doesn't mean that it's inherently bad or inherently, you know, problematic or disordered. So we want to make sure we're not imposing our own version of what normal eating means, right? And really get curious around, is this a way of eating that works for this person, that feels, you know, like it actually helps them meet their needs? And if that's the case, you know, can we embrace that and make that part, you know, of the treatment or their lives? So on that note, we have provided a lot of information in a short amount of time today. We tried to get to the pieces that, you know, felt really important to name, but we would like to repeat the word cloud to see where how folks are feeling now. So I'm just going to invite folks to go back to the exact same link. And it's the same code once again. And I'm just going to share my screen again in case people want to find that. Oh, I'm not sharing the right thing. Give me one moment. There we go. Is this the right one? No, yes, okay, good. So same question as last time. How do you feel at the thought of providing or advocating for neurodiversity affirming eating disorder care? So if folks want to head back to the same menti.com, plug in the same code, 58465211. Hopeful, excited, better prepared, wanting to learn more. I love that. This is like definitely a takeaway from this session, right? Is that we're just like dipping into the topic. So love that people want to learn more. I love that someone wrote that they're feeling seen. That's really powerful. more prepared, feeling held, more confident, empowered, exhausted. Again, very fair. Validated, intrigued. Trying to catch some of the ones I haven't said yet. I'm probably repeating myself. Passionate. I love all of these. Curious, unsure, very fair, right? This is a lot of information. And you're also allowed to disagree with some of the things we've shared today too, right? I encourage you to take what we shared and like, be critical of it, for sure. Especially if you're someone who has lived experience of neurodivergence and an eating disorder. Yeah. Inclusive, more awareness, moved. Love that. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to flip it back to our slides, but I really, really appreciate everyone, completing this. It's really lovely for us to see as facilitators. I think I'm speaking for Sophie, but awesome. Okay. All right. We are almost done with our slides. I will flip it back to Sophie to kind of wrap us up, and then we will have a little bit of time for questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Josée. Yeah, in making this presentation, obviously, we didn't know how the second word cloud was going to go. I'm really excited to see a bunch of you are feeling more confident. So we thought we would just end out this presentation with just this little note, and then Josée is going to name some takeaways for us all. Then we can move into Q&A. So, I mean, I wouldn't be a therapist if I didn't end on this note of being kind. But, in addition to coming up against systemic ableism, a lot of neurodivergent folks have experienced interpersonal trauma. So this can mean advocating for oneself with family, friends, and certainly in mental health and medical settings, intimidating and potentially re-traumatizing. So for practitioners, this is a reminder to be kind and patient with folks disclosing potentially vulnerable details about themselves and their lives. And for neurodivergent folks, this is a reminder to be kind and patient with yourself as you navigate advocating for your needs.
Absolutely. And I know that, both Sophie and I just dream of a world where self-advocacy is not needed, right? Where the conditions for people to thrive in eating disorder treatment are already existing, right? And we all know that that's not where we're at right now. And we do want to hold some space for that, right? That even with this knowledge, going into treatment, people might face a lot of harm. And yeah, all we can say is that, we really hope that, like given the interest, for example, in this presentation, right? And the fact that people are wanting to learn more, that we're very hopeful that means that we'll be taking steps in the right direction in that sense. But thank you everyone for being here. So last thing, a few takeaways. Hopefully we probably, repeated ourselves in terms of this along the way, but clients really know themselves best, right? And this is really important to remember, right? If we think about like the self-diagnosis piece, if we think about, people coming into treatment and saying, actually, like this doesn't feel like a concern or a problem to me, right? Like this is just part of who I am, and I want to make this part of my recovery. We can learn to trust that and get curious and make space for that. We want to consider the sensory, executive functioning, communication, and emotional regulation needs that people are bringing into their experience. We want to acknowledge the impact of trauma and oppression. And this includes in previous eating disorder treatment experiences, right? I think we have an opportunity to validate the harm that people have experienced, because that's very real. And of course, staying curious, flexible, non-judgmental, right? I think those are all qualities that at least as therapists we thrive for, right? Or strive for. But we thought we'd throw that in there because it felt really important. And then we have some resources for folks, and they are in the slides. We've sent the slides in advance, and so folks can go in and, look those things up as well. And then we just had a few references that we used. And then that's it for us. So I'm going to stop sharing and see if anyone had any questions that we may or may not be able to answer.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I have 3 questions that I've collected through the chat, and Natalie's also been keeping a close eye on the chat too, Natalie. So if some of the ones that I say aren't ones that you have, just feel free to send them via direct message and we can pose them to Josée and Sophie. Josée and Sophie, ditto the same kindness back to you. Don't feel like the pressure to feel like you have to answer these questions on the spot. If you feel like you want to follow up with something, we can always communicate with all of the attendees through the YouTube description or through the post webinar email. And so just let us know if we you want to hit pause on any of these questions. Question number 1. Emily's asking, how do you discern between a neurodivergent need to stim and client tendencies to multitask during virtual appointments, avoiding the topic at hand, etc.? Any flags or signs that you look for as you explore this with your client directly? Because I'm sure it varies often.
I have thoughts.
Yeah, as do I. Go ahead.
So the first thing that came to mind for me is really going back to that piece around getting curious about people's intentions, right? And so I think the piece around just asking, right? So, hey, I'm noticing, that you're moving your body a lot, or that, you seem to be doing something else. Like, tell me more about that, right? And I'm always, I always love having a better sense of the purpose that behaviors play, right, in people's lives. So that would probably be my first kind of gut instinct, would be to get at the role that that's playing for this person. And then, of course, if they are avoiding talking about certain things, getting really curious about that too, right? There might be reasons for that. Maybe there actually needs to be more trust building happening in the relationship. Maybe people don't feel that they can access enough safety yet, right, to address certain things or talk about certain things. And so we can be really sensitive to that and allow people to go at their own pace. So yeah, those were the thoughts that came to mind for me. Sophie, would you?
Those are like a very well articulated version of the thoughts that came to my mind. So thank you.
Fair. Awesome.
Cool. I'll move on to question 2. Chris had asked for Q&A, can we get some examples of getting to needs rather than focusing in on emotions? And maybe this is for fellow practitioners, I'm guessing, Chris, but you can correct me otherwise.
Absolutely. Sophie, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, I can talk about needs. Sounds good to me. Sometimes in my work with neurodivergent folks, when we sort of start to talk about emotions, they're like, listen, I don't know where we're going. All I know is that, like, logically I need like this, and this to accomplish this. And I think a lot of time in therapy, we're kind of discouraged to like bypass emotions. And I certainly don't want to I don't want to create an environment where folks like can't access their emotions. But in terms of getting to the need, one thing that I find really helpful, sort of similar to like an emotion sensation wheel, like Lindsay Brahman has, if anyone is familiar with like nonviolent communication and that whole process, they generally, like in the book, like there's like a list of just like common human needs. I found one online. I'm just gonna like put it in the chat. So sometimes, like if someone's having a hard time identifying their needs, especially in the context of neurodivergent folks whose like memory, might work differently than a neurotypical person's, I bring out this needs inventory or something similar and say, like, is anything sort of jumping out at you? What do you have a sense of that like is missing right now? So yeah, I just love starting from a list. I don't know if you have any different thoughts, Josée.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. But there's also the piece around how, like, I kind of see emotions as being messengers in terms of what we might need, right? And so I know that sometimes the work around like being able to better identify emotions is so that people can then better meet their needs. But there might be ways that we can actually like bypass the emotions piece, right? So exactly, like going through a list or like getting curious about, what need might be going unmet, right, might be helpful. So for example, you know, in some cases, if people are experiencing sadness, they might need comfort, they might need connection, right? But we don't necessarily need to name that it's sadness for them to be able to, you know, identify that those are the needs. So that's what kind of we meant in terms of bypassing, you know, the naming of emotions. And that's not something we're saying like we should do across the board in terms of, you know, being therapists or, you know, if people have access to that information, great, right? Or if they want to build awareness of like their body sensations and their emotions, there's a lot of room for that. But I don't think we need to wait necessarily until people have access to that information in order to know how to meet their needs or have awareness of what their needs are. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Question number 3 from Irene is asking, any tips for how to cope with people who tell you that you are so sensitive, in all caps? What has that looked like for the two of you? And I feel like your reaction to that's also part of an answer, right? It's a real experience.
I'm having a hard time knowing how to answer that, but like my heart is just like, I don't know what my heart is doing. I don't know. I want to like hug the person who asked that. Yeah, not everyone's going to understand. And that's really, really, really hard. I wish I had a better answer than that. I just want to validate that it's really, really hard when you're going through something, no matter what it is. And folks who care about you and that you care about and whose opinion you really sort of like hold in high regard, can't seem to quite understand. I mean, you can direct them to talks like this and things like that if they're interested. But I don't know. I don't really know where to go from that. I'm just like feeling a lot of tenderness from like that question even being asked.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I have a lot of compassion for that. And yeah, you know, the thing that I want to name is that it can be very easy to internalize that message, right? And to start believing ourselves that we are like overly sensitive or overreacting, right? And so sometimes, you know, we can start by like examining that, right? And maybe exploring situations where we can access enough safety to feel that we're not too much, right? Or we're not overreacting, or we're not overly sensitive, right? So finding those situations where, like, yeah, where you can unmask and feel that you are, you know, just enough, right? But yes, that also, you know, just brings to mind for me, like just how much work we need to do systemically, right? And structurally, so that people can, can know that their sensory processing differences are not deficits, right? And so, yeah, I don't think either of us had a particular solution to that, just like lots of compassion.
Actually, I love what Irina has put in the chat. I've come to accept that my sensitivity comes with being thoughtful, caring, loving, kind, genuine, sincere. I come as a full package. Oh, that's it. That's the good stuff.
Thanks, you too, and thanks, Irina. 4th question from Hope, who's naming that they have a neurodivergent client who is autistic and has a food-related trauma, which for me constitutes CPTSD or chronic PTSD. They not only cannot prepare food, never learned, but also due to their trauma feel that they do not deserve food, that there won't be enough, and have an anorexic behavior. What would be the best way to support this person? And I guess one thing I can couch this with to start hope, because I don't know if we'll be able to do justice by this question in the time that we have remaining, is while NEDIC's helpline services aren't a clinical consult line, I think you can always reach out and ask your questions there, because maybe we'd be able to support for resources, because my heart immediately went to, how do we help you get support around supporting this client? Because that sounds like a lot, but just throwing it to Josée and Sophie if they have any off the cuff thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of layers there, right? And I agree that I don't think we'll necessarily be able to do this question justice in this short amount of time. But the first theme that comes to mind for me is definitely the theme of safety, right? So getting really curious around, are there foods or are there food-related situations that do feel more tolerable, right? Or where they can access more safety, or are there opportunities to increase their sense of safety, right? Around eating. And is there an opportunity, to explore that? Again, right, I think I am someone who truly believes that like any way that people are able to access nourishment is going to be valid, right? And so we can start where people are and build on that with time. And then of course there's all the underlying work, right, of really working through like the messages that this person has internalized about themselves. And I don't know, my brain is going in all sorts of different directions because I think there's a lot to look at there, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks. And yeah, there was a wonderful comment from Yafi in the chat that I'm just going to read out too, so it's on the recording. Who notes, I'm a dietitian and I usually default to cooking with people. How that's carried out in a therapeutic manner is always client-led. It also may not always be appropriate, but there are ways to increase space between the body and the food sensory experience during the cooking process, and those can be modified for neurodiversity. So just another idea for you as well. Sophie, anything on this question too? Okay. There are obviously still questions that are left, and we want to thank people for asking it and also be respectful of people's time. There are ways to get in touch with Sophie and Josée that are on their slides if you would like to. There's also ways to get in touch with Caitlin at Sheena's place or myself at NEDIC in case you want to get in touch with us around resources, because we can maybe field some of these questions. Like Caitlin has put into the chat, we do have a anonymous feedback survey that doesn't take very long that we are able to share the compiled comments with Josée and Sophie for their own learning, and for us in terms of where people would want to go next if we wanted to expand on this topic. So if you have thoughts, please take the time to do that. That survey is going to be included in your follow-up email as well. But otherwise, thank you for your time. You'll get a follow-up email right now, and then you'll also have one in about a week or two's time with the recording and any further resources. Thank you, and take care, everyone.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
Thank you.